Throughout the medieval period, kings and knights who sought glory on the battlefield often found not victory, but violent death. Some died in reckless charges against overwhelming odds. Others perished when fortresses they defended collapsed around them, crushing their bodies beneath thousands of tons of stone. What follows are 9 battles where commanders made fatal decisions, where sieges ended in catastrophic collapse, and where warriors learned too late that courage alone could not overcome superior numbers, better tactics, or simple bad luck. The Young King's Fatal Charge, November 10, 1444. Varna, on the shores of the Black Sea. King Władysław III of Poland and Hungary was just 20 years old when he led his Crusader army against the Ottoman Empire. Young and ambitious, he had earned a reputation as a fierce warrior despite his age. Advisors called him the Night King for his preference to lead from the front rather than command from safety. His Christian coalition faced the mighty Ottoman army commanded by Sultan Murad II. The battle began favorably for the Crusaders. Their heavy cavalry smashed through the Ottoman flanks, sending thousands of Turkish soldiers fleeing. Victory seemed within reach. Władysław, watching from a nearby hill, saw what appeared to be disorder around the Sultan's elite guard at the center. Despite urgent warnings from his experienced commanders, the young king made a fateful decision. With just 500 of his Polish and Hungarian knights, Władysław spurred his horse forward. The small force thundered across the battlefield, lances lowered, heading directly for the heart of the Ottoman army. At first, the charge succeeded brilliantly. The heavily armored knights tore through the front lines of Janissaries, their momentum unstoppable. Witnesses later said the king himself came within yards of Sultan Murad. Then the trap closed. Thousands of fresh Ottoman troops surged forward from hidden positions. The Crusader knights found themselves completely surrounded. The tight formation broke apart as horses fell, pierced by arrows and spears from all directions. Władysław fought desperately, his sword rising and falling as Janissaries pressed in around him. An Ottoman soldier grabbed the bridle of the king's horse. Another slashed at his leg, cutting deep enough to sever an artery. Blood poured from the wound as Władysław struggled to remain upright. His horse, panicked and wounded, reared suddenly. The weakened king lost his grip and fell among the press of enemy soldiers. The Janissaries fell upon him immediately. One swung his sword in a powerful arc, striking the king's neck. Władysław's head was severed with a single blow. Ottoman soldiers raised it on a spear, parading the grisly trophy before the horrified Crusader army. The battle was effectively over. The crusade had failed because a 20-year-old king chose glory over prudence. If you value this kind of detailed battlefield history that examines the fatal decisions commanders made in the heat of battle, please consider liking this video. The Last Emperor's Final Stand, May 29, 1453, Constantinople. Emperor Constantine XV. Palaiologos knew what was coming. For 53 days, the massive Ottoman army of Sultan Mehmed II had besieged Constantinople. The once mighty Byzantine Empire had shrunk to little more than the city itself. Constantine, 48 years old, and the last emperor of a 1,000-year dynasty, had just 7,000 defenders against more than 80,000 Ottoman troops. The Ottomans had spent weeks pounding the ancient Theodosian walls with massive cannons. Some of these bronze monsters could fire stone balls weighing over 700 pounds. Sections of the walls that had stood for 1,000 years crumbled under this relentless bombardment. By dawn on that final day, several breaches were wide enough for Ottoman troops to pour through. Constantine had spent the night praying in the Hagia Sophia, Christendom's greatest cathedral. At first light, he donned his armor and rode to the walls. The noise was deafening. Thousands of Janissaries, the Sultan's elite troops, surged forward in waves. The defenders fought desperately, pouring boiling oil on the attackers and pushing scaling ladders away from the walls. For hours, the emperor moved along the defenses, encouraging his men. Near the St. Romanus Gate, where the fighting was most intense, Constantine received word that Ottomans had found an unlocked postern gate and were already inside the city. The defense was collapsing. What happened next was recorded by several witnesses who survived. The emperor, realizing all was lost, removed his imperial regalia. "The city has fallen, and I am still alive," he reportedly said. Then, drawing his sword, he charged directly into the thickest mass of Janissaries pouring through the main breach. A few loyal guards followed him. The lightly armored emperor disappeared into a sea of Ottoman soldiers. Slashing desperately, he managed to cut down several before being surrounded completely. Multiple swords struck him simultaneously. Constantine fell to his knees, blood pouring from wounds to his neck and torso. A final sword thrust pierced his heart. The last Byzantine emperor died as his city fell around him. His body was never positively identified amid the carnage. The farmers' massacre at Visby, July 27, 1361. Gotland, Sweden. The wealthy trading city of Visby on the Swedish island of Gotland faced an approaching Danish army. King Valdemar IV, known as Atterdag, New Day, had arrived with 2,000 professional soldiers, heavily armored knights, trained footmen, and skilled crossbowmen. The citizens of Visby, mostly merchants and craftsmen, stayed safely behind their massive stone walls. The rural farmers of Gotland, however, decided to fight. Nearly 2,000 farmers and peasants gathered outside the city walls that morning. They were poorly equipped for battle. Some had hunting spears or wood-cutting axes. Others carried only farming tools, scythes, flails, and wooden pitchforks. Few had any armor beyond thick leather jerkins. None had trained together as soldiers. Archaeological evidence later confirmed most wore everyday clothes, not military gear. The Danish force that approached was the pinnacle of medieval military technology. Knights wore full plate armor that made them nearly invulnerable to the farmers' weapons. Their war horses were themselves armored. Crossbowmen could strike from distances the defenders couldn't hope to reach. When battle was joined around noon, the outcome was never in doubt. Danish crossbowmen opened fire first. Hundreds of steel-tipped bolts tore through the disorganized farmer ranks. Men fell screaming, bolts punching through unprotected chests and throats. Those who survived this initial barrage faced the heavy cavalry. Charging knights smashed into the farmer lines, lances splintering ribs and puncturing internal organs. Those who dropped their weapons in surrender were cut down without mercy. Archaeological excavations later revealed the brutality of this one-sided fight. Skulls split completely in half by sword blows. Bodies with 5 or 6 stab wounds to the torso. Men with both legs severed who had clearly bled to death on the field. The skeletons showed defensive wounds on hands and arms where desperate farmers tried to ward off killing blows. Within an hour, it was over. The field outside Visby's walls was carpeted with bodies, blood soaked into the summer soil. The few survivors fled into nearby forests. Inside the city, Visby's leaders watched in horror as more than 1,800 of their countrymen lay dead or dying in the summer heat. They immediately opened negotiations with Valdemar rather than suffer the same fate. Buried alive at Rhodes, September 1522. Rhodes. The Knights Hospitaller had held the island of Rhodes for over 200 years. Their massive fortifications were considered among the strongest in the Mediterranean. But in July 1522, the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent arrived with a force of 100,000 men. The knights numbered just 600, supported by a few thousand local militia. The defenders knew this would be a fight to the death. By September, the situation had grown desperate. The Ottomans focused their attack on the English post, a critical section of the city's defenses. Using techniques perfected over decades of siege warfare, Turkish sappers dug tunnels beneath the massive walls. These narrow passages were filled with gunpowder, creating massive underground mines. On September 4th, before dawn, the first mine detonated. The explosion was deafening. A section of wall 30 feet wide collapsed into the moat below. Hundreds of Ottoman troops rushed forward, screaming their war cries. The knights, though stunned by the blast, fought back fiercely. Sir Nicholas Hussey, commander of the English post, led the defense. Eyewitnesses described him as covered in blood from head to toe, yet fighting like a man possessed. For 6 hours, the knights held the breach against overwhelming numbers. Bodies piled up so high that Ottoman troops had to climb over their own dead to continue the attack. By midday, the knights had miraculously repulsed the assault. But the victory was short-lived. Turkish engineers had already begun digging new tunnels. MIDCTA. These battles reveal how medieval warfare often came down to numbers, technology, and careful planning rather than individual heroism. What do you think was the most critical factor in determining victory? Share your thoughts in the comments. On September 5th, a second mine detonated directly beneath the position where Sir Nicholas and 20 knights were standing. The explosion was even larger than the first. The knights had no warning. The stone floor beneath their feet suddenly erupted in a shower of rock and flame. Sir Nicholas and his men were hurled 50 feet into the air by the force of the blast. Those not killed instantly by the explosion were crushed as they fell back to earth amid massive blocks of masonry. Others, still alive but trapped, were slowly suffocated as dust filled their lungs in the enclosed spaces beneath the rubble. The Knights Hospitaller would eventually surrender Rhodes after a 6-month siege, negotiating safe passage. But Sir Nicholas and his men never left the island. Their bodies remained entombed beneath the ruins of the English post. The Templars' fortress collapse, May 1291. Acre, Holy Land. The city of Acre had been the last major Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land. By May 18, 1291, most of the city had already fallen to the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil and his army of 70,000. Only the temple, a massive fortress complex controlled by the Knights Templar, still held out. The building was among the strongest in the Middle East, with walls over 15 feet thick and towers rising 80 feet into the air. Inside, 200 Knights Templar prepared for their final battle. Their Grand Master, Guillaume de Beaujeu, had been killed days earlier by an arrow through the eye. Now leadership fell to Peter de Sèvres, Marshal of the Order. The Knights knew there would be no surrender. Templars captured in previous battles had been tortured to death after refusing to convert to Islam. They would fight to the last man. For 10 days, the Templars held their fortress against continuous assault. Mamluk siege engines hurled stones weighing hundreds of pounds against the walls. Turkish sappers dug beneath the foundations, placing gunpowder charges in tunnels. Despite the overwhelming odds, the Templars repelled attack after attack. They fought with the desperation of men who knew death was certain. On May 28th, Sultan al-Ashraf ordered his engineers to collapse the main fortress. Hundreds of slaves had spent days undermining the foundations, replacing stone with wooden supports. At his command, these supports were burned away. What happened next was recorded by several Mamluk chroniclers who witnessed the event. The ground beneath the temple began to tremble. Knights inside felt the floor shifting beneath their feet. Cracks appeared in walls that had stood for 200 years. Some Templars tried to flee through a small postern gate leading to the harbor, but Mamluk archers cut them down. Then, with a sound like thunder, the entire structure collapsed. Thousands of tons of stone crashed downward. Knights who weren't crushed immediately found themselves buried alive in pitch darkness. Their screams could be heard through the rubble as they slowly suffocated in sealed pockets of air. Some survived for hours, trapped beneath massive stones, before the rising tide from the nearby sea flooded the ruins, drowning those who remained. The fall of Acre marked the end of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. The Knights Templar would never recover from the loss of their fortress and so many of their warriors. The French Knights' arrogant charge, September 25, 1396, Nicopolis, Bulgaria. A Crusader army of 15,000 faced the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid Berfur's force of 60,000 on the plains of modern-day Bulgaria. Leading the European contingent was the 24-year-old Count John of Nevers, son of the Duke of Burgundy. Young, wealthy, and arrogant, he commanded the flower of French chivalry, over 8,000 knights and men-at-arms who considered themselves the finest warriors in Christendom. King Sigismund of Hungary, an experienced commander, had urged caution. His plan was to use Hungarian infantry as a shield, with the heavily armored French knights held in reserve for the decisive moment. The French nobles openly mocked the strategy. Count Philip of Artois sneered that Sigismund was afraid to fight. The French commanders declared they would lead the attack themselves to show how real knights fought. Despite desperate pleas from Sigismund, the French knights charged forward. It was a hot day with temperatures over 90 degrees. The knights wore full-plate armor weighing more than 60 pounds. Many were already exhausted when they reached the Ottoman lines, having galloped uphill for nearly a mile. The first Turkish troops broke and fled before the armored horsemen. The French, seeing the enemy retreat, pursued eagerly. What they didn't realize was that they were being drawn into a trap. Cresting a ridge, the knights suddenly faced thousands of sharpened wooden stakes driven into the ground at an angle. Their horses couldn't advance. Behind these stakes waited 10,000 janissaries armed with composite bows. A storm of arrows struck the French knights from three sides. Unable to advance or retreat, horses and riders began to fall. The arrows found gaps in their armor, eye slits, armpits, groins. Those who dismounted to fight on foot found their heavy armor made them too slow against the lightly equipped Turkish soldiers. Within minutes, the flower of French nobility was surrounded and overwhelmed. Some knights, gasping for breath in the heat, tore off their helmets only to have arrows pierce their exposed faces. Others, immobilized by arrow wounds, were dragged from their horses and had their throats cut. Count John himself, wounded in 7 places, collapsed unconscious in a pool of his own blood. He survived only because his captors recognized his value as a ransom prisoner. The Battle of Nicopolis was one of the worst defeats in crusading history, a disaster caused entirely by French arrogance and refusal to follow a sound battle plan. The price of glory. These 9 battles span nearly 2 centuries and stretch from the Balkans to the Holy Land, from Sweden to Hungary. Yet they share common themes: reckless courage that became fatal folly, fortresses that became tombs, and warriors who learned too late that bravery alone could not overcome superior numbers or tactics. King Władysław III died because he charged with 500 knights against thousands. Emperor Constantine XIII chose to die fighting rather than flee. 1,800 farmers were slaughtered because they faced professional soldiers with farm tools. Knights Hospitaller were buried alive when mines collapsed their fortress. The Knights Templar were crushed beneath their own stronghold. French nobles were massacred because they refused to follow sound strategy. Prince Lazar was beheaded after his gamble on the Sultan's death failed. The Janissaries died because greed destroyed their discipline. These deaths reveal several truths about medieval warfare. First, individual heroism, however genuine, could not overcome numerical superiority and superior tactics. Władysław's charge and Constantine's final stand were brave but futile. Second, military technology increasingly favored siege warfare over defensive positions. The Knights at Rhodes and the Templars at Acre learned that even the strongest fortresses could be collapsed with properly placed mines. Third, discipline and planning mattered more than aristocratic pride. The French Knights at Nicopolis and the Janissaries at Belgrade both failed because they abandoned tactical discipline. The French through arrogance, the Janissaries through greed. Fourth, the human cost of medieval warfare was staggering. The massacre at Visby showed what happened when untrained civilians faced professional soldiers. Archaeological evidence reveals the horrific wounds these men suffered: split skulls, severed limbs, multiple stab wounds. Fifth, leadership failures had catastrophic consequences. Young King Władysław's rash decision to charge killed him and destroyed his army. The French nobles' refusal to follow King Sigismund's plan led to disaster at Nicopolis. Modern military historians studying these battles emphasize that medieval warfare, while often romanticized as a time of chivalry and honor, was, in reality, brutal, chaotic, and often decided by factors beyond any commander's control: terrain, weather, morale, and simple luck. The warriors who died in these battles, whether kings, knights, or common farmers, were not abstract historical figures but real men who experienced terror, pain, and death. The archaeological and chronicle evidence preserves their final moments. The Serbian farmer whose skull was split in half at Visby, the Templar knight slowly suffocating in darkness beneath collapsed stone, the French nobleman gasping for air in his heavy armor under the hot sun at Nicopolis. These battles also demonstrate how quickly fortunes could change on medieval battlefields. At Varna, the Crusaders were winning until Władysław charged. At Kosovo, the Serbians seemed to have turned the tide by killing the Sultan, only to lose when his son rallied the troops. At Belgrade, the Ottomans had secured a breach, until their troops broke discipline. The lesson these battles teach is not that courage was worthless, but that courage without wisdom, discipline, and sound tactics led to unnecessary death. Medieval warfare rewarded careful planning, numerical superiority, and technological advantage far more reliably than it rewarded individual acts of bravery. If this examination of medieval battlefield deaths and the tactical failures that caused them intrigued you, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more historical documentaries that reveal the brutal realities behind romanticized history. Thank you for watching.